Right, good afternoon everybody. It's great to be here. Thank you for inviting me. Half an hour isn't really that long to talk about mental health first aid, so it is just going to be a bit of a whistle-stop tour, but hopefully it'll just give you something to think about, and you might be able to talk about what you want to do with it in the future. So I'm going to briefly go through why we need to do it, how we do it, and what happens after we've had training. I'm accredited through Mental Health First Aid England, but I'm currently working for Leeds Beckett University, so I deliver to them, to staff, to support students, for staff to support their own self-care, and also just for people to look after each other's general well-being. Okay, before I go into it, I just want to talk a bit about mental health because there's so much misinformation out there. So I just thought, is there anybody here who actually is a mental health first aider? Anyone in the room? Yeah, a few hands up, that's great. So what we're going to do is I'm just going to go through a quick quiz, just some true or false, higher or lower facts, just to see what knowledge is in the room. So the first question, mental ill health is responsible for 9 million working days lost in the UK each year. I want you to put your hands up if you think this is true. Oh, that's quite a high amount. So how many for false? A smaller amount. Okay, for those of you that think it's false, do you think it's higher or lower? Higher. Higher, in the spirit of Bruce Forsyth and Play Your Cards Right. It actually is higher, yes. It's 91 million working days lost, so it's much, much higher. More so than any other sort of physical health. One of the trends here is that when people are off with mental health issues, they tend not to be off for just 1 day or 2 days. It can often be weeks, months, or sometimes even years. So number 2, total cost of mental ill health in England is estimated at £105.2 billion. Hands up if you think that's true. Oh, more cautious this time, just a few. Hands up if you think it's false. Okay, and if it's false, do you think it's higher or lower? Higher. Higher, let's take a look. It's actually true, that one. Put that in there just to surprise you all. £105.2 billion is a hard figure to get your head round. But when you think of what that's made up of, it's things like medication, resources, loss of production, lost working days, all sorts of different things that make that figure up. So number 3. 25% of mental health issues start before the age of 18. Okay, so we've already got somebody at the front say it's false. So hands up anyone else who thinks this is false. Okay, hands up for true. Oh, about half and half. For anyone that thinks it's false, do we think it's higher or lower? Let's take a look. It's much higher, yes, 75%. So when you think of those joyful teenage years and those happy school days, actually, as a child, we're dealing with lots of different traumas throughout those years, lots of biological things going on, lots of emotional changes. So that's when a lot of these issues really kick in. And sometimes we don't realize how much they've affected us until much later on in life. Okay, number 4, in 2017, there were 6,213 suicides registered in the UK and Republic of Ireland. Who thinks this figure is true? Okay, small amount of you. So the rest of you all think it's false. Do you think it's higher or lower? Okay, let's have a look. This one's actually true. And this is based on information from the Samaritans. The 2018 figures have recently been released, and I think they're just a little bit higher. It's a bit of a hard figure to quantify and get your head around this. It's obviously 6,213 too many, but yeah, it's quite an alarming figure. So moving on to number 5, suicide is the most common cause of death for men aged between 20 and 49. Anybody think this one's true? Yeah, the majority. It's quite a well-publicised fact at the moment, this one. It is true, yeah. So more than any other illness, suicide is the most common cause of death. There are lots of places out there to help with people who are suffering with suicidal thoughts at the moment. We tend to think of the Samaritans as the main one, but in the last sort of 15, 20 years, because there's been such a growth in the figures, there's lots of other great organisations out there now. There's Mindwell, Student Mind, and also there's a great national group locally called Andy's Man Club, which has been set up specifically for men to talk in a safe environment about suicidal thoughts, because there's lots of research out there that show that generally men are not as good at talking about the feelings as women. There's also some informal research out there that men in Yorkshire are not particularly good as well. Whether that's true or not, I can't say. Okay, so that's a bit about the why we need to do the training. How do we train people? Well, Mental Health First Aid is run by Mental Health First Aid England, and it's a course that can either last a day. I run a day specifically aimed at the higher education sector. There's also a 2-day course which goes into the same subject but in a bit more depth. The subjects that we cover in the courses are things like attitudes around mental health. We talk about the mental health continuum, which is a bit like the learning spectrum, and how we're all on it in different shapes and forms. And then we talk about specific conditions. So we talk about how to support people who feel depressed, people coping with bipolar, people living with anxiety disorders. Then we talk about very specific things like eating disorders, psychosis, suicide, self-harm. And again, it's about raising awareness, being able to create conversations and breaking down some of the barriers of stigma, because there's a lot of stigma around mental health. The course itself, before I tell you what it enables you to do, what it doesn't enable you to do is just as important. It isn't about training you up to be a mental health professional, or to be a counsellor, or to be a GP. It's a 1 or a 2-day course. So what it's about is enabling you to recognise the symptoms of mental ill health and spot some of those conditions in people. And then the C word, this is a really important word, it's all about having confidence to start conversations about it. Having conversations to provide initial help, because we don't all have to be a professional, mental health professional or a GP to provide initial help. Some of that help is also about signposting, and with the course comes some great resources about where to signpost help, all the different types of organisations, as well as, more importantly, different methods of communication. So some people like face-to-face groups, some people like self-help, some people like online help. So there's all different resources out there. So it's about signposting people to those. A big part of the course as well is about your own well-being and your self-care. Because for those of you that are already out there supporting friends, supporting colleagues, supporting people you manage, you'll know yourself how that can be really tiring sometimes, and you actually need support yourself. So we talk a lot about your own self-care and general well-being in there. And it's also about developing an understanding about how you can take your learning away from the course and actually change the culture around you. And that's a massive part of mental health first aid. And that's where it differs slightly to just mental health awareness training. It's all about instigating a culture within your community. Okay, so I've been delivering the course just within Leeds Beckett for the last 2 or 3 years. And one of the questions and the discussions that we often have in the course is when we start talking about it, is the sort of fear and caution around it. And lots of people often say to me, but Chris, I'm only a course administrator. I don't know how to resolve somebody's mental health issues, or I'm just a lecturer. You know, I can't be responsible for this. This isn't my job. And that's a really interesting discussion, because as mental health first aiders, we're not training you to be able to solve the issues and to be able to provide the solutions, but we are training you to support people. So what I want you to do now is just have 2 minutes just on the tables and with the people that you're with, just have a think about this question, looking after our mental health. Whose responsibility actually is it? So I'll give you 2 minutes just to talk amongst yourselves. Okay, everybody, let's take a pause there. It feels a shame to interrupt so many discussions because it's great to see everybody talking. What you've been demonstrating there is like a massive part of mental health, which is actually just having the discussions and talking about it. Did anybody feel actually a bit cautious about having a discussion about that? Or did people feel comfortable? Okay. So in terms of whose responsibility it is, let's just take a look. Big part of is the NHS. They're often the people who provide the diagnosis, often provide the resources, provide the medication, but they're only just part of a much bigger picture. Can't expect them to do everything. Your own family or your own peer group can play a massive part as well. A big part of mental health first aid is actually the word recovery, because we talk about the continuum that we all on as part of our mental health, from when we have sometimes good, positive mental health to sometimes ill mental health. And we talk about the recovery process that we're always going through. And a big part of that is our support network, whether it's your friends, your family, or whoever. There's also a massive responsibility on the individual. We can't just, there isn't a magic wand that, the NHS can wave or society can wave and make all these problems go away. We all have to play a part, and as individuals ourselves, sometimes we have to do things differently. So we might have to change our mindset. Sometimes we might have to take the medication that we're given, even if we might not always agree with the diagnosis. Sometimes we might have to make changes in our life. Sometimes we might have to maybe change our peer group or change our workplace to improve our health. And sometimes, we have to make quite difficult changes sometimes, but we do have to accept some self-responsibility. Mental health professionals, great. These could be counsellors, there could be GPs, there could be psychoanalysts, all these different people are great. Sometimes there's a long waiting list to get onto them. Sometimes you might not agree with what you tell you. Sometimes people might fight the diagnosis, they might disagree with it, but we need these people to be in the loop. And then back to the workplace itself. Yes, those people that say to me, Chris, I'm a course administrator, I'm a cleaner, I'm a lecturer, I'm not here to solve the problem. I tell them, yeah, you're absolutely right, you're not there to solve the problem, but we're there to create an atmosphere of support, a community of well-being. And that's important that we recognise that. We need to go far beyond just the legal obligations that we all have, the Equality Act, the Health and Safety at Work Act, and actually start looking at people as individuals and make sure that we've got systems in place, procedures in place, strategies in place, and also that we're actually out there as people creating this culture. And also a big part of our support network is the actual environment that we live in. And society and community as a whole can play a big part in our mental health. Often we don't realise how much the environment around us can impact us. There's things like sick building syndrome. The way we design buildings can have an impact on our mental health. The way we can design our office space can have an impact on our mental health. And the way we design communities can have a massive impact on our mental health. We're still seeing the results of, lots of poor planning from years ago about the way we live and the way we cohabit and interact as communities having a massive impact. And, we've seen the results of how some environments are just not conducive to that. Okay, so I couldn't come to a UCISA conference and just talk about mental health without talking about technology as well. And this is such an interesting subject, the impact of technology on our mental health. Anybody recognise this picture on the left? Has anybody ever done that? If you haven't done it, you probably see it happening, and I'm sure you can imagine, you can see what it's trying to say. We all know the problems about technology on our mental health. We read stories every day in the news, and we hear these stories about the time about too much reliance on technology, too much pressures that it places on individuals, on society, on generations, and things like that. I'm sure I don't need to educate you about the negative impact. The stories that we see less of in the news are things about the positive impact of technology on our mental health. And it's really been really great for me today to come to a conference like this and listen to the talks throughout these days that have been so much about assistive technology empowering people and changing people's lives. Because I think outside of a conference like this, we often forget about that. And certainly if you look in the media and the portrayal of mental health and technology, and even if you just go onto the internet, and if you just put in impact of technology on mental health, you'll see millions and millions of stories with a negative angle, but we need to forget that we have to remember that there are lots of positive ones as well. Social media has been in the news so much recently, and the Royal Society for Public Health did a lot of work and a lot of research into the media portrayals and also just social media platforms generally linked with people's mental health. So again, in your tables, I just want you to have a think about when the survey came out, what the results were for the best social media platform in terms of mental health, as voted for by young people, and what is the worst. There's lots and lots in between, but I just want you to try and think about what was voted the worst and why, and what was voted the best and why. So 2 minutes for that. Okay, let's take a pause. Some very lively discussions and lively debates going on there. Okay, so does anybody want to take a guess at what was voted the worst for positive mental health? Oh, a mixed reaction. I've heard Facebook, I've heard Twitter, I've heard Instagram. Any more takers? Snapchat, WhatsApp? Any others? Reddit, yeah. Okay. Those were the days. The one that was voted the worst by far, leagues ahead, worst of all the others, was Instagram. Yeah. Any thoughts as to why? Yeah, the filters, yeah, the pressures, the judges, the isolation that it causes people who don't feel that they conform to certain standards or certain expectations. Very visual, very quick, but those images just go straight in here and can be burned in there for such a long time. So yeah, so Instagram, yeah, voted the worst by far. And just recently, in the last few months, there's been lots and lots of stories on the news about the impact of Instagram. I have to say, when you start digging into the research about social media platforms, the research is still very much split. You know, we're still relatively in the early days of social media. And the jury's still out as to how big an impact it's having, and there's lots of ongoing research. Any thoughts on what was voted a very clear leader on the best social platform for positive mental health? WhatsApp, Snapchat, Facebook, Instagram again, you think? Any others? What? You think Instagram again? No. I don't think anybody's mentioned it so far. Periscope? What? I don't even know what that one is. MySpace? We're really going back in time, aren't we now? Let me put you out of your misery. It might be, nobody's mentioned this. Maybe it's because you don't think of it as a social media platform. It's not the one that comes straight to mind, but you're correct. It's YouTube. Yeah, and this was a clear leader. Anybody want to guess why this is seen as positive for their mental health? Yeah, so it is about, yeah, it can be about voicing opinions and feeling part of a community. So lots of the young people that voted in this added comments about how YouTube was used for them as a chance to get their opinions across, and also as a chance for not feeling alone by watching other people's broadcasts on there. So particularly groups that we, not minority groups, but people that were feeling particularly isolated. So, you know, people like LGBT community, people on the disability forums, people from international backgrounds, or people that were different in any way, saw YouTube as something massively empowering. So that's an interesting one, isn't it? And also when you think about YouTube, the format of it, it's possibly less addictive than things like Instagram, that you need to take a bit longer, you're spending a bit more time on it, so it's not as instant as things. Okay, so going back to social media, because this suffers such a bad press generally, I always sort of think, is it as clear-cut as that? You know, social media is just a really powerful tool. It's not that, you know, I want to try and move away from it's a good or it's a bad thing. It's actually just a really powerful thing. But it's also something that's an essential part of society and part of our lives now, isn't it? We can't make it go away. It's there, and we need to learn to recognize its power and to deal with it. In terms of it being a friend or foe to our mental health, what I want you to do now is just spend 2 minutes thinking about how you can make it a friend to your mental health, because we all know the reasons why it can be an enemy, but I want you to just spend 2 minutes on talking about some of the positive aspects of social media. Okay, time to take a pause, I'm afraid, folks. Now, that was really interesting when I first threw out that question, because unlike the other two questions that straight away generated a response, this one's actually a bit hard, and there's a bit of a pause amongst you all before you start your discussions on this, because you do have to think in a way, don't you? When can social media be our friend? I haven't got a chance today to share your conversations, fortunately, or to show a YouTube clip that I really like showing with this bit. But the film is about, it's called How Social Media Saved My Life. And when you go onto the internet and you put in social media and mental health, you get like 98% negative hits and stories about how it's got negative impact. But there are some positive things out there, and there's a great story from somebody about how it saved his life. And he talks about how instead of posting the usual things every day about what he'd done, what holidays he was on, where he was at, what concert he'd been to, and getting like very few responses, or just the usual things, one day when he was feeling really low and really down, he posted it. And he said that one message got more hits and responses than any of the other things he'd put, because all of a sudden, he said he was inundated with friends and people saying, "You're not alone, I feel like this sometimes," and sending positive comments and saying, "Thanks for posting this." And actually what it did, and amongst his peer group, it made him recognise how big a support network he had. And it opened the discussions about how he'd actually been dealing with depression and anxiety for a long time, even though nobody would have known it from his posts. And it just made him start thinking about how important it is not to feel alone and to talk about these things, rather than just thinking, "Oh, I'll just mask it and I'll just send pictures every time I'm doing something exciting." And that's a massive part of just, as a mental health first aider, just thinking about how we use technology differently and how it doesn't have to be a negative thing in terms of social media. We can use it to really help people feel part of things. And again, when we do our own social media usage, try and just think before we send things. We don't have to fall into the stereotypes of all those negative stories that we hear. We can use it to send uplifting messages. We can use it to be more honest. We can use it to create discussions. So it's just something to think about. So today has just been a very quick whistle stop through the world of mental health. In the full 1 day or 2 day course, we talk about these things, we create a safe space to have the discussions, we talk about how to support people, what to say, what not to say. And this is some of the feedback that we generally get from these sessions. I have to say, in all the sessions that I've delivered over the last 2 or 3 years, the feedback is generally like 99.9% positive. But there are certain trends that run through. And if you look on here, there's some of these trends that are here. So a big part of it is breaking some of the stigma around talking about mental health. So breaking the embarrassment, finding it quite empowering. Lots of people often find a whole day of this very challenging, especially when we talk about issues that might be very personal to some people. And it's really important that we create that safe space, because at the end of it, people often come to me and they'll say, "Wow, Chris, that course was just so much." And they often need time to take it in and to think about it. They always say they enjoyed it, but challenging is a word that does come up a lot. Talks again in there about I'm much more confident in talking about health, about mental health. It's affected me, it's made me reevaluate my views, because a lot of it is about breaking down the myths of it. So it's great that people say it's reevaluated my views and my behaviour. It's increased my knowledge, increased my understanding. What I'm trying to dig a bit deeper in delivering these sessions now is about what people do with it afterwards, because it's not just an awareness session or just a confidence session. That's great, but what I want people to do is really go away and use it and live life as a mental health first aider. And the type of feedback that I love getting is when people put things like this: "I've instigated some follow-ups in my workplace since this session." And this is really what a mental health first aider is about. What are those things they've instigated? All sorts of different things. Sometimes it's just the way that they talk to people differently. Sometimes it's things like putting it on their email auto signature or something that they're a mental health first aider. You can come and talk to me. I've had stories about people that have created thinking spaces or well-being spaces within their workplace or within their office. I had a team last week that said they now, in their team meetings, they have an agenda point every single monthly meeting about mental health issues. And they said in that, it's an open forum for people to talk about things. And within that, it can be things like an agreement not to send out emails 24 hours a day. It can be creating the discussion about whether you're going to contact people at work during the weekend. Or just about creating other discussions about things that might help people and just creating that air of openness to talk about these things. So those are the things that are really sort of making a mental health first aid role a really real and practical role. Okay, quick quiz to end up with then. 1 in 5 people take a day off due to stress, yet 55% of these people cited a different reason for their absence. Anybody think that figure's true? Okay. Those of you that's false, do you think it's higher or lower? Yeah, it's much higher, sadly. It's 90%. Yeah, still a lot of stigma about that, about ringing up and saying, I can't come in today, I'm suffering with anxiety. My depression's really bad today. Anything like that. We often use excuses to mask that. Number 2, 15% of employees who disclosed mental health issues to their line manager reported being disciplined, dismissed or demoted. Anybody think this one's true? True or higher? It is actually true, this one. It could be higher because we only know the people that have actually come forward and said that. So you could take that with a pinch of salt. What about number 3? The UK has one of the highest self-harm rates in Europe. Hands up for true? Yeah, you're all correct. It is true, sadly, this one. Lots of theories out there as to why. There's no specific evidence. One fact that I often hear mentioned is that we also have the highest working hours rate in Europe. So whether that's something that plays a part, I don't know. Number 4, 16% of UK health research spending goes on mental health. A few nods. We all think that's false. Do we think it's higher or lower? Yes, sadly it is lower. So it isn't comparative with the amount of cases that they're dealing with. So yeah, it's just 6%. And number 5, geographically, in England, London has the highest suicide rate in the country. True or false? Hands up for true. And hands up for false? Yeah, you're right. It is actually false. London has actually got the lowest rate in England. Whether that's because, no, lots of other reasons. Could be that there's a lot of resources out there. The place that's got the highest rate is actually the northeast. So a couple of trends that fall into the northeast. Lots of rural areas, lots of isolation. High rate of unemployment. All these things can play a part with suicide. Okay, so before I go into any other questions, I'm going to ask you one question. And can anybody guess what question I'm going to ask? Has anybody seen the subliminal message today? This is the question I'm going to ask you. So the answer I hope that you are gathering is that anybody, any single one of you, every single one of you has got the power to change attitudes towards mental health. So you don't have to be a GP, you don't have to be a mental health professional. You can listen and talk to people. That can be any one of us. Thank you very much. Any questions?
I just want to say thank you, Chris. Personally, standing on the stage now to say this, I suffer with anxiety. I say suffer, I manage it, I'm fine. I think that's a really important talk. One thing I'm going to go in and really promote is the mental health first aid in my work environment. I think everyone in here, if we can go away and at least we get half the room do these courses, I think that's a real massive improvement. I noticed when you did ask the question, there wasn't a great deal of people put their hands up. So if that's one takeaway from the day, next year maybe you'll ask the question and see how that goes. But questions?
Hi.
Hi. So great presentation. I'm really glad that that was included in the schedule for today. So I've suffered from bipolar disorder probably since I was about 15 or 16, but I was only ever diagnosed when I was in my mid-20s. So I went through university and my first few jobs, really confused as to why I was struggling through it. And the bit that got me is when we were talking about who's responsible for spotting mental health issues, and it's the family bit. Because despite the fact that I found out my dad's had bipolar disorder since he was a child, he kept telling me there was nothing wrong with me. And what he was doing, he was trying to protect me by trying to prop me up, make me feel happy. There's nothing wrong with me. I'm not unusual. But what that actually did is that caused me further problems because I convinced myself there was nothing wrong with me, but I still knew there was something that was really, really affecting me. So whilst he was protecting me, it's better to be honest and try and spot things, especially for those of you that have got children, because that will help them in the long run. And it's a very, very difficult situation to be in, but my advice is just look out for symptoms and take people to go and see a doctor if you think there's something potentially wrong, because that will benefit them in the long term.
Brilliant, thank you.
More questions? Okay, we've got a small break now till 4 o'clock, so just back in the exhibition area. Could I please ask that you do visit all the vendors if possible? There's still there for the rest of the day and tomorrow, and we will be back in here at 4 o'clock for the Celebrating Success sessions. Okay, thank you.